And the history of that was that it was made during World War II because a ship called the RMS Niagara had hit a German mine and sunk off the coast of New Zealand. And the Niagara was carrying 8 tons of gold.
Off Gassing, a scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. I have always had a fascination with history. As a kid, watching movies or reading stories about past events is something that has always piqued my interest. Late last year, I had the opportunity to speak with adventure historian Jeff Maynard. Through Jeff's writings, he brings diving history to life with titles such as Divers in Time, Australia's Untold History, Niagara's Gold, and The Frontier Below, the past, present, and future of our quest to go deeper underwater. We speak about his adventures to uncover history, his thoughts on writer's block, advice for up-and-coming writers, and much more. Please enjoy. Jeff, how are you doing this beautiful morning?
I'm good. Nick, how are you?
I am good. Just getting the day started, got my coffee, did a couple replies on emails. That's always good. And yeah, just looking forward to hearing about what you got going on. So currently, where are you located?
I'm located in Melbourne, Australia, which is down the bottom part of Australia, and a lovely sunny summer's day here. So I'm looking forward to getting out and getting in the water.
Awesome. Well, we'll jump right in. So my first question I always like to ask is, tell me how and why you got into scuba diving. Tell me about that first breath, that first experience. What led you into this whole world?
I took up diving as a recreation, purely as a sort of weekend scuba diver, about 35 years ago. It was one of those things where I thought, that looks cool, I'll give that a try. And went down to the local dive shop, walked in the door and heard the sales pitch and thought, okay, I'll sign up. So I signed up, bought some fins and a mask and those sorts of things, and did the course, which was a couple of weeks of lectures and weekend dives and things. And the first time I went underwater was they took us to a local swim centre where they had a big, about 5 metre deep diving pool. And we all put our units on and jumped in the water and went down to sat on the bottom and took our masks off and went through our drills. And I did all that and came up and thought, when the instructor sort of said, that's it, up we go. I thought, that's pretty crummy. That's only about 15 minutes underwater. That's not very good. And I got up and had a look at it. I think I'd been underwater for about 50 minutes to an hour, but it just gone so quick. It's like, that's amazing. I love this. This is great. So, it was purely recreational diving that got me into it. But what was different then, and like I say, I'm going back 35 years, was there was no Google, there was no sort of internet. But what we did have was in Australia a couple of magazines, colour magazines that came out every couple of months on diving, and one was Sport Diver, and the other one was called Scuba Diver. And so I started buying them and reading articles. And from there, the dive club there was a part of said, we're going for a trip to the Solomon Islands. And I thought, that sounds great. I'm in this. It was just a sort of typical club dive tour. So I put my name down for that. And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll be clever here. I rang up one of the magazine editors and said, look, I'm off to the Solomon Islands on this big exotic dive expedition type thing. I'll write an article for you. And my agenda was basically, well, if I do that, I'll be able to claim the expenses as a tax deduction if I get the article published. And I remember the editor said to me, he said, I've got articles on diving around Pacific Islands. He said, I've got enough of them if I started publishing now, I could publish them for the next 100 years and not run out of articles. He said, do something different. If you're going to write. So I looked at the magazines and thought, gee, here's people writing about fish and going somewhere, and no one's writing about the history of diving. Is there a history? I knew nothing about it. And I went down to the local library and looked up a few books and saw pictures of fellows in big copper helmets and lead boots and people in aqualungs and things, and read about this fella called Jacques Cousteau. And I thought, oh, don't know much about this. Anyway, I went back to the magazine editor and said, I think I can do you a column each issue. I'll do a column on the history of diving. And the editor said, "Oh, is there a history? How many columns do you reckon you could do?" And I said, "Oh, I think I could probably do maybe 5 or 6 at least." So they said, "Go ahead," and I started doing that. And I think it was about 15 years later, the magazine was absorbed by Asian Diver, and I was up to an article about number 80 or 90 or something, and I
Oh,
still had
wow.
more in my desk. And it was just like, oh, once I started, I got into this subject, and it was like, here's all this information. Why aren't people talking about it? And I found, I obviously kept diving and keep diving now, but I just found it fascinating and started researching, and it sort of went from there.
Okay, okay. So did you have a history, like a background of writing? Is that what prompted you to want to write the articles for the magazine?
Yes, I did. I had a background as a freelance journalist, and I worked in marketing as a writer. So when I thought go to somewhere exotic like the Solomon Islands, just put the article in the magazine, and that's tax deductible for me. So that was the original agenda. I could save a little bit of money here and do a dive trip once or twice a year and get it as a tax deduction. So that was the agenda. But when the editor said no, right, he said, I got everyone writes about fish and coral and wrecks. Do something different, and that's what led me to it.
No, that's awesome. And to be honest, I like how you took that no and then you were like, well, how can I make this work? It didn't deter you or stop you. You're like, oh, okay, well, I'm not going to write an article about this. Instead of giving up, you were like, hey, what else can I do to add to this magazine? So that's awesome. How did you originally get into writing, and was it just something from a young age you had a passion for, or did you just kind of fall into it?
That was the same thing. I was passionate from about writing from probably 9 or 10 years old. I remember telling my mum when I was about probably 11 or 12, I'm going to be a writer. And my mum and dad said, well, there goes your career. You'll never make any money. you you know, can't you be something sensible? We could, go to plumbing school or become an electrician or something. At least you'll make a living. No, mum, I'm going to be a writer. And I sort of sat at home. Finished school and sat at home, sort of sat in my bedroom writing stories and sending them off to magazines and having them rejected and all that kind of thing. And then I was also into motorbikes, or still am, ride motorbikes. And there was a newspaper had articles where you send in a test on whatever motorcycle you had. So I sent them an article on whatever bike I had at the time, and they published it and said, "Oh, that was good. Do more." So I ended up getting a job with it, with the newspaper, Motorcycle News, and worked there for about 5 years, writing road testing motorbikes, and
Oh, cool.
it went on from there. So I sort of I had a youth which was very much misspent, riding motorcycles all the time and taking photographs of them, or trying to convince young ladies to sit on them. And while I got a photograph, that's how I made a living for about 5 years. And
That does not sound too bad. That does not sound too bad. I actually have a friend who he restores vintage motorcycles, and it's definitely it is a little bit niche, but he's done very well for himself, and just that the history, the nostalgic aspect of it, people absolutely love it because what he'll do is he'll actually go and find just an old Easy Rider magazine or an old article with a showcase bike that's been long and forgotten, and he'll actually search out and seek and rebuild that bike to where it was 1970, 1980, 1960, or whatever. Yeah, history always, I feel like it's been one of my favorite subjects since I was a kid. So just to there's just so much behind it. So when you were researching and going and trying to find all this scuba diving history, what path did that lead you down?
it was slow at the beginning, because you have to remember this was late 1980s, perhaps early 1990s. So even before email, I started off, I read a reference to a company in England that had made old diving equipment. So I literally rang. There was an international telephone number exchange where you would ring them up and say, I need the phone number of such and such a company in, say, London. And they'd look it up and they'd give it to you over the phone. So I got the phone number of this company, sat up till like 1 o'clock in the morning until, they would be awake. And I phoned them and said, I'm calling from Australia. Has anybody written any sort of brochures or booklets or anything about the history of your company? And the receptionist was helpful. She said, no, not really, but there is a fellow here who's been going through our archive and finding lots of old photos. I'll give you his name and address. So she gave me that, and I wrote him an airmail letter. And sort of a month later, I got a letter back from him saying, I'm researching the history of diving helmets, and we started corresponding by airmail letters. And then, being in Australia, I would haunt secondhand bookshops and find old books on pearl divers or someone who dived particular wrecks and things like that. And I would correspond with this person in England, and got to know other people. And we started swapping books, secondhand books, and sending them by international post. And it sort of grew from there. We took the handbrake off in about mid 1990s when everyone started sticking a modem into their computer and being able to send emails. And that really changed everything, because you weren't waiting. You weren't going down the post office, sending off a parcel and waiting a month for a reply. And of course, as the internet developed, of course, you start doing searches and people started setting up websites, and it just, the whole network grew. And it is an international network now of people researching different subjects. And of course, we have so much better access. We can talk like you and I are talking now, and that really helped a lot.
So when you started researching, you said you kind of started with the company in, I'm sorry, was it England?
Yeah, so the company was called CB Gorman. They were 150, 160 years old. Their founder had manufactured the first sort of commercial diving helmet, which is the big copper helmet and the lead boots and all that kind of thing. I read a reference that CB Gorman was still in existence, and so I looked them up in the international sort of telephone thing, and phoned them at 1 o'clock in the morning and started from there.
Cool. So when you started going down that avenue, did you know it was going to open up into what it has become for you today?
Not really. I mean, I thought it would be one of those small subcult things where a few crazy people can talk to each other and have an interest. But it's actually expanded much wider than that. First of all, and again, because of the convenience of communicating with the internet, there's just so many people interested now. And it has an appeal, like your friend, with the appeal of finding an old motorcycle that's got a little bit of history about it and restoring it or getting it back on the road. Same way people like to restore an old car or get an old clock and make it work. It's got an appeal there a little bit now to get the old gear and get it back in the water. So it's quite universal. There's societies in Italy, France, England, America, of course, all around the world where people are sharing information and going and diving the old gear. I didn't think it would get that big that quickly, and I didn't think either that it would get out into the general public, get into a wider audience. I originally thought that it would stay very much a sort of cliquey little sort of group of oddball people with their equipment, but it's become much wider and I suppose acceptable and accessible to a wider people, and interesting to them.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. And so when the world started opening up and you saw that there was more interest, that led to you actually, and I don't know if your first book was diving history, but that led to you started, instead of articles, you branched out and started putting out books.
Yes, well, I was writing a couple of books anyway, not related to diving, but one of the stories I came across, which was in my own backyard, so to speak, is that about 50, 60 miles from where I live, someone said there's an old diving chamber sitting in a museum. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So one weekend I jumped in the car and I went to a place called Castlemaine in Victoria, and they had this huge 2.5 ton diving chamber where a man would climb inside and look out the windows, and they'd lower it on a cable. And the history of that was that it was made during World War II because a ship called the RMS Niagara had hit a German mine and sunk off the coast of New Zealand. And the Niagara was carrying 8 tons of gold. And it was about 400 feet, which is 130 meters or 160 meters or whatever. But it was quite deep. It was too deep for people in copper helmets. So this Melbourne team devised a way of, they built this chamber. They got an old ship. They sailed out into the minefield. The mines were still there. And they would lower the chamber underwater, blast their way into the ship. And they got 8 tons of gold out and gave it back to the Bank of England because it belonged to the Bank of England for the war effort. And they gave it back. As a sort of a sidebar to the whole diving history thing, I researched that story. And there were 4 of the original men still alive. So I went around and interviewed them. One of the fellas said, oh, we took a movie camera and we filmed it all when we did it in 1941. So I tracked down the grandson of one of the people, and he had the film and he gave it to me. So I had that converted, and I made a TV documentary out of that. And then I went on and I wrote a book about how they got the gold out of the ship during World War II. So it was sort of a diving history story, but it was a bit of a shipwreck and a World War II story at the same time. That was published, and then I did another one. I thought, oh well, I've got all this information. I should do a book on just the history of diving in Australia and how the pearl divers started. So I did that book, and it kind of grew. And at the same time, I'm running off, and I have other interests, and polar exploration is one of them, and I'm running off writing books on that as well. So I got sort of pretty busy, and anyway, it sort of just grew from there, and I started spending just hours at my desk, kind of cranking out and doing this research and cranking out these books, and diving's always been a big part of it.
No, that's awesome. So I do have a couple questions on that, but let me bring it back just a little bit. So when did you know that you wanted to write your first book? I mean, I feel like articles to a book is probably a pretty common transition, but when was it like, hey, I'm going to write a book. Let me put this all together. And then my follow-up question on that is, what goes all into writing a book? Like, you're talking about the research, like with the shipwreck, you kind of just heard about that. Did you know that you were going to write a book about that from the onset, or did it just kind of develop into that idea?
I'm a bit of a believer that you don't find your stories, that your stories find you. So I was writing articles and working in marketing, writing advertising to make a living. And when I found the shipwreck story and I found the 4 men still alive who I could interview, when the first one contacted me and said, look, I'm still alive, I hear you're interested in this. It was one of those light bulb moments. It's like, I have to tell this story. This is just such an amazing story. If it takes me 10 years to get this book published, it will be worth it. This is something I have to do. And I think for me anyway, there's always that moment where it's like, this is in front of me and I can't go around it or over it or under it. I have to actually do this until this story is told. That's how it is for me. And so I, sit down, start the research. And of course, with history, there's a lot of work goes into the research. Years. What I'm doing is constantly gathering information, having files, putting them aside, doing something else, coming back until you build up till the file of the story is so big that you can't do anything else but write the book. It's there, it's in front of you. That's how it is, kind of thing. It's a compulsion on one way because I can't do anything else until I've written this book. I have to get this out of my system and sit it on a bookshelf and walk away, and then I can do something else. But it becomes a compulsion. You can't help it. Your stories do find you.
Okay. So when you have all the information, you've collected it, are you at this point, you're like, I have enough information to put a book out there. Where do you start with all that information? Because I guess so. I'm trying my hand at writing. I'm not very good at it. Usually, I joke around and I'm like, yeah. Usually, I'll jot some stuff down, and then after about 15-20 minutes, it goes in the trash bin because I'm like, I don't like the way that is. I don't like the way that sounds. So you have all this information. Where do you start? How do you know where to start? Where you're gonna end? I mean, obviously, with a story, sometimes it might. I would assume it might be a little easier. Okay, start at the beginning of the story, go to the end of the story. But how do you start? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, look, it does make sense. I always say there's two ways to write a book, or two ways to approach it. One way is to think of it like a road trip, where you say, I'm going to go there. Let's jump in the car, head off. We'll describe what we see along the way, and we'll roughly get to where we're going. Now, that's one way to do it. And travel books are written like that. I'm going to go to Italy and I'm going to write a book about my experiences. Or autobiographies or biographies are written like that. I'm going to write about this person. Okay, they were born, they grew up. I've talked about that, and it's linear. You tell their story. That's one way to approach a book. Think of it as a road trip. The other way to approach a book is to think of it like building a house. You can't sort of say, look, I'm going to build a house. I've got a block of land. Okay, let's start putting some bricks together and let's see what happens. You have to approach it from the other end. You have to say, what's it going to look like when it's finished? It's going to be a 2-story house with doors here, windows there. And so you actually start at the end, work out what it's going to look like, and then work back and plan it all the way through. If it's going to be that, then the frame has to look like this, and I need these materials. And so you don't really start writing until you've got a very detailed plan of what's going to be at each stage. And that's the other way of writing a book. And that's probably how I do these books is I would sit down and say, what am I going to talk about? And I often use big pieces of project card, big pieces of paper, and map it out and say, well, I'm going to start here. I'm going to get to that point. What are the steps along the way? And I'll sketch them out and then shuffle them around. Screenwriters often do this when they're writing movie scripts. They'll use flashcards and they'll write each scene on a little card and they'll pin them on the wall and say, well, this scene and then that scene and that. Then they'll move a scene to a different place and shuffle them around and say, okay, it's starting to work now. And so you have a plan before you start writing. And that's the opposite way of sitting down and saying, well, day one of my road trip, I'm off and it's a sunny day and, we're driving through the country. That's one way of doing it. The other way is to have everything planned out, and then you sort of start at the outside and work in. And then you say, okay, well, my first chapter is I have to cover this material. What information do I have? And then I'll just write it out in sort of rough format. And then I'll write out the second and third until that. And then I go back and I start to trim it up. What don't I need? What do I need? How can I, I'm spending too much time on this subject. It's getting boring. Toss something out. That's how I do it. I kind of map it all out, and I have this big map of exactly what I'm going to write on for each chapter, and then I fill in notes for each chapter, and then the notes become sentences, and the sentences become paragraphs, and I build it up like that, which is a rotten process because it's really hard and it takes a long time, but that's basically how I do it. The Frontier Below, which is my latest book about the history of going from the top to the bottom of the ocean, I mapped that out, and then I started writing each chapter because it's a big subject. You're starting in sort of ancient times with pearl divers in Greece jumping in the water, or sponge divers, and you're going right up to reaching the bottom of the ocean, and then what technology we're going to use in the future. I was mapping that out, and from the time I was sort of drawing out my project cards of saying, how do I cover this entire subject? It was probably about 4 years' work to actually write it, and then, throw bits out and bring other bits in, and sort of say, well, we're talking about the bathyscaphs in the 1950s and how they were going deeper underwater. How much do we need here? How much before the reader's going to get bored with that? And you've got to get on because you're constantly trying to communicate what is pretty technical information of how they did this and how they made that or how they overcame the pressure. And with that technical information, it can get pretty boring if you're not careful. So it's a lot of the skill or the art or the luck of the whole thing is to basically say, I'm going to teach you, I'm going to get you to read how Jacques Cousteau and another fellow co-invented the aqualung. So I'm going to talk about that. But if I just talk about the nuts and bolts of it, you're going to be bored very quickly. And you're sort of going to say, yeah, okay, really interesting, but I can just look up a Wikipedia entry if I need that sort of stuff. But so I sort of work it like that, and like I say, it's a slow process because I kind of change it and massage it and throw bits out and put bits in. But that's just how I do it.
As somebody from the outside looking in, we always, one thing you hear about when people are writing is the dreaded writer's block. Does that happen to you? And then when it does, how do you overcome that?
Well, yeah, touchy subject for me, Nick, because I don't think writer's block exists.
Okay.
It's a myth. Okay. I'm sort of going to go out on it's a myth. I look at it this way. Have you ever seen an alcoholic sit down in front of a bottle of whiskey and all his family is saying, you've got permission to drink the whiskey. We really want you to drink the whiskey. And the alcoholic looks at it and says, no, sorry, I can't. I've got drinker's block. I just can't drink it. There's no such frigging thing. You have to get that, If you're a writer and you've got your story, as I said before, if your story has found you, your problem is not getting started. Your problem is stopping.
Okay.
Your problem is stopping to be civil to your family, or stopping to pay the gas bill, or stopping to go and, walk the dog or do something, brush your teeth or eat or something. I mean, it's the opposite. When you've got that story, you've just sort of, you just live it. You can't stop, So I don't know what writer's block is. I think it's a myth. If you're not drinking the whiskey, it's one of two things. You're either not an alcoholic or there's no bottle of whiskey in front of you, So if you're not writing, you're either not a writer or you haven't got your story. That's it. Okay. So writer's block, don't get me started.
Okay. I apologize. That's a great analogy, though. Oh, that's funny. Obviously, you're writing a book about these subjects. I'm assuming they're all passion projects. Is there one that is near and dear to your heart that you're like, oh, I want to get this story out there? I mean, obviously, you're writing books, so all the stories you want to get out there. But which one would you say is like closest to your heart? Like, I'm glad I got this story out. The joy of researching it.
The book that's just come out a few months ago is The Frontier Below, which is the history. And I think when I said, 3 or 4 years to write it, the research and the passion really goes back to that 35 years ago when I took up diving. That was important to me to get that book out, but it was important from another point of view because, as I say to people, it's not really, well, on one level, it's a history of diving, or how we got to the bottom of the ocean, because you've got the deep sea submersibles and all the other technology in there as well. But in another way, it was important because it was, in a sense, like a history of our human relationship with the ocean. And it was not only important for me to get the book out, but to get it out to a non-diving audience. That was really important for me. I want divers to read it, but I want mum and dads who have never dived to read it, because I think it changes the way people look at the ocean and think about it. And it will make people more aware. One of the analogies I like to use about writing about history is Antarctica, because Antarctica is obviously environmentally sensitive. If I sit down and write a book about the ecology and the environment of Antarctica, 10 people in the world are going to read it, and 8 of those are already going to know about it anyway. It's going to be very difficult to make people aware. But if I sit down and write a book about Shackleton or Scott and Amundsen and their race to get to the South Pole, suddenly people who've never been to Antarctica are interested in the subject and they become aware of it. And every year, you have thousands of people paying lots of money to get on a cruise ship to go down to the Antarctic Peninsula and, get off and walk around and go home and tell their friends, I've been to Antarctica. Or they go to South Georgia and they get a photo of themselves standing beside Shackleton's grave. And so it's the actual history of the place that makes people aware of it and get them into it and to learn about Antarctica or want to go there. And so history is a sort of, it's like a magnet for people that we want to actually learn. And so what I did with The Frontier Below was to say, we've got this whole world beneath the surface of the ocean, not only, vital to the future of the planet, but it's just so enormous and so little known that, how do we get people to think about it? How do we get people drawn into the subject and say, I'm interested? And I thought, well, one way I could do it was to do it through history. Because if I start talking about, like, in the 1950s, there was a couple of baterscapes and how they were developed and the rivalries between the people who owned them. And, one got down to, became the first to get to 2 kilometres deep underwater. Then the other one got to 3 kilometres, and then the first one got to 4 kilometres, and that was their, and this sort of race between them. People go, I've never heard of that. I didn't know that was going on. And how did they do it? How did they develop the technology? And then when it went from there, the French, who had one of them, sort of said, well, we can't go any deeper in this one. We have to build a new one. So they started building a new one. And the Swiss, the Picards, who owned the other one, they said, we can't go any deeper in this. So they sold it to the Americans, and they redeveloped it and got to the bottom of the ocean first in 1960. And this whole story of this sort of, I call it the race to the deep, this whole, people aren't aware of it. If I say, who were the first people to get to the top of Mount Everest? They rattle off the name. Who was the first man to walk on the moon? People say, oh, of course, Neil Armstrong. We know that, and the Wright brothers first to, have powered flight and take off an airplane. I say, well, who were the first people to get to the bottom of the ocean, and when and how? And it's like people start scratching their heads. And yet the ocean is so important to all of us. We should be we know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the bottom of the ocean. And just saying to people, how deep is it? How far do you go down in the water? And when you start talking about how deep it is, people are quite amazed. And so that kind of thing, I thought, well, one way to sort of broaden the interest and get people involved is to write about it, but take them into the ocean through history. And that's kind of what this little interest of, years ago writing articles on who invented the aqualung sort of started there. And it's kind of grown into this kind of topic that I'm quite passionate about, obviously.
Yeah, no, that's I love it because you have the subject, a very well-known subject, and it's just taking a different approach to get people to look at the subject. So I really, really like that approach. What is your favorite part in the whole process of writing a book? Is it the seeking out and interviewing, finding people to interview, stumbling across this lost piece of information, finally sitting down and putting it all together? The book is done, closed, off to the publisher. I don't know if that's the correct term, but out of the whole process from start to finish, what would you say is your favorite part?
That's a tough question. I have to sort of say all of it, which is kind of weird, I know. But there are, in any process, there's just moments where it's like almost joyful. Oh, wow, this is working, things like that. I think another aspect of it, but what you said about, finding that piece of information, I think in some ways we're all explorers. Now, this will sound a bit strange, but we all are explorers. We all like to seek things and find them, Our problem is the world is a globe. And because it's a globe, it has a finite surface area. There's only so far you can go in one direction before you don't come back on yourself and you're back to where you started. So if you think about the 20th century, we got to the top of the highest mountain, we got to the bottom of the deepest sea, we got to the North Pole and the South Pole. I mean, we even went off and got to the moon. So We've mapped the whole globe, and now Google Maps can take you anywhere and show you anything. So, as that sort of explorer within us, where do we go? And I sort of say, well, we can go back in time and we can discover a story. Going back, imagine a soldier in World War One sitting in the trenches and he's writing a letter to his mother, and he's about to go over the top and get all this, and he's writing this really intense personal letter. And imagine that letter sitting in a box somewhere for 100 years or more, and then you come along and you open it and you read it. It's like a little time machine. It's like suddenly you're back there getting this kind of passion and fear and love and everything like that sort of thing. And that kind of discovery, I mean, I find it really quite exciting. It's like, wow, look what look at this. No one else has found this. I've found this, and I found this story. So that for me is one of the reasons I love the research. The process itself, which, as I said, takes years, is kind of like it all. I'm the sort of person that I'm happiest when no one's talking to me, and I go and sit in the corner and I'm writing something. Just leave me alone and let me play with these words. I want to shuffle the words around, and I want to sort of put this word here, and oh, that sounds better. And the words for me are always like a kind of music. And I sort of think, oh, I'll read it a few times. Oh no, I'll move this word over there, and that'll sound better. And so it takes a long time, but I like to do that so that you've got this kind of, you'll hear the story, and that's very important for me. But right through the end, it's like, you get the first sort of author editions come from the publisher, and you put it and you look at it and say, yep, there it is. Terrific, wave it in front of your family. That's what I've been doing for the last 5 years. What do you think about that? And your kids sort of look and go, oh yeah, no, good, Dad, well done. No worries. Okay. What's for dinner? Yeah, all parts. You just got to love the process. You got to love the journey, and I do.
Awesome. No, I love that answer. So, do you have a highlight research moment, kind of like as you're talking about it, I'm thinking about Indiana Jones when he finally makes it to the back of I can't remember which movie, and then he picks up the artifact. It's just glowing and shining, and the music's playing. Do you have a highlight moment researching something? Maybe not, you're not sure if it's true, or that journey to finding it, and that is there a highlight moment for you?
There probably is. One of the people that I research is an obscure Australian polar explorer called Sir Hubert Wilkins. And he did a lot of amazing things in his life. He was the first to fly an aeroplane across the top of the world, and he first to fly in Antarctica. And 1931, he attempted to go to the North Pole under the Arctic ice in a submarine. And I was researching him because no one had heard of him. And I started going to America and finding his records, because he died in America. He left all his stuff over there. But one of the other things he did, which a lot of people didn't realise, was he was the official photographer, official Australian photographer at the Western Front in World War One. And Australia has this amazing collection of World War One photographs, taken thousands of them in the Australian War Memorial. But no one's ever been able to sort of decide who took which photo. Which photographer. He had a number of photographers working for him. Who took what or where? There's just no records. All the records were destroyed. And I was in America. The person had boxes of this material that belonged to Sir Hubert Wilkins. And I'd gone up to Michigan, and he had a big shed out the back, and we were sitting in the shed, and I'm going through all these boxes and all this sort of stuff. And I picked up a book. And I thought, oh, no, not very important. I'll have a quick flick through it. And it was a book where Wilkins had gone through and he'd listed or initialed photographs that he had taken in World War One. And it was like, wow, this has to go back to Australia. It was my Indiana Jones moment. This is going back. I'm putting this in the Australian War Memorial. This is part of Australia's heritage and history. The World War Anzac story. This has to go back to the War Memorial. This has to. And so I talked to Mike, who was the fellow who had it all, and he said, "Yeah, no worries. You can take it back." So it wasn't a big sort of putting it on a pillow and carrying it back. I think he let me take it. I think I wrapped it in an old T-shirt and put it on my sort of check-on luggage and just took it back. So that there was no sort of big parade when I got back or any of that kind of stuff. It just got tossed in the luggage. But that to me, I always remember that when I sort of opened that up and realised what it was, and just went. I remember looking at Mike and saying, "This is going back to Australia." So that was a bit of an Indiana Jones moment for me.
Oh no, I mean it's almost you'd have like chills going up your spine because for a long period of time not knowing and then now sitting in your hands is the knowledge to
Yeah.
kind of just answer all those questions. No, that's yeah, that's an amazing story. I love that. Just because especially to find it in you said in a shed in Wisconsin.
It was actually in an Amish barn. So more to the story, because you see the pictures of the Amish and all that, and I'm thinking this unique Australian Anzac record, and I thought, yeah, I'm sitting in this Amish barn in a little place called Fremont, Michigan, and it's like, yeah, here it is, got it. But the guy I got it off wasn't Amish. He's Mike Ross. He wasn't Amish, and I said, how come you put all the stuff in the Amish barn? He said, oh, Amish were my neighbours. It's a funny story because Mike was a gunsmith, and he literally made guns. He made high precision rifles for target shooting. And he said, when I bought here, he bought like 10 acres of land or something. And he said, when I came here, the Amish came and knocked on my door, and they said, look, they hunt for their food. They don't buy a frozen chicken in the supermarket. He said, they knocked on my door and they said, look, do you mind? We hunt deer and wild turkey, and we've been hunting on your land. Do you mind if we keep doing it? Feed the family, sort of thing. He said, no, I don't have a problem with that. And because he was a gunsmith, he looked at their guns because they've got these old rifles, and the Amish, because they won't have photo ID, they can't buy new firearms in America, but they can by all those sort of wonderful laws that nobody quite understands anywhere else in the world, that they can go in and pay cash and buy second-hand guns. So the Amish go and buy second-hand guns for cash. And Mike looked at these guys' guns and said, oh, look, I'm a gunsmith. That gun there, it's like, that's a bit dangerous. I'll fix the bolt action or something for you. Bring it over. And so he did. He said, I fixed the guy's gun. And then he said, I said to the fellas, look, bring your friends over and I'll check all their guns for them. No charge. Just bring them over. I'll make sure they're all safe. Like I said, the next morning I got up and I walked out on my front veranda, and there's about 20 Amish guys standing in my front yard with rifles, and he said, oh, okay. So he said, I fixed their guns. I fixed he said one guy had this old sort of muzzle loading thing that should have been in a museum. He said, I fixed all their guns for them and we became good friends. And he said, I've been to Amish weddings and, I helped them out because he said they'd come over. If they wanted to order something, they couldn't, they had no fax machines or anything. He said they'd give me cash. I'd get it for them and give it to them. He said, we became good friends. And so when I got all this stuff off Sir Hubert Wilkins, which he'd inherited, or which he'd taken out of the farmhouse, that's another story. But he had all this stuff. He said, I just said, look, can I put this in your barn and store it there? And they said, yeah, sure. Many years later, I'm getting off at Grand Rapids Airport and driving up to Fremont, and Mike took me out to an Amish barn, and I started doing this kind of research on this obscure polar explorer from Australia. But that's the way it happens, I didn't have to sort of run out of burning buildings or do any Indiana Jones stuff, but it was I must admit, it was kind of weird to be, sitting in an Amish barn looking up World War I Anzac records, but there you go.
Oh man, that's I feel like I want to know more about that whole story. There's a lot there. Just I feel like that could be the start of a movie. Just 20 Amish people just in front of your house with guns. Like, where is this gonna go? So, last couple questions for you. Who are your inspirations for writing? Do you have a favorite author or authors?
I've got a few actually, and it's usually Somerset Maugham, Thomas Hardy, not so much Hemingway, although Hemingway's not too bad. John Steinbeck. I like the kind of, I suppose you'd say, the classic writers, because as I said, I hear a music in the words, and when you get your ear attuned to it, you like music. There's so many different styles. Whether you play 19th century classical music or 1960s country and western music. You know the different styles. And what I look for is a kind of a style and a music about the words that I think, yeah, look, I like the way they're going. A lot of modern authors, they're, and I'm sort of getting off topic of diving history here a bit, but a lot of the modern authors, their sentences are just like crisp, short, punchy. I like an author that can actually construct a good sentence, and it might be quite long, might be three or four clauses and a couple of phrases, but they'll actually construct it in such a way that it's pleasant to read and pleasant to listen to. So yeah, more the classic guys, I'd say, for favorite authors.
Have you ever been to Hemingway's house? I actually went there a few years ago out in Key. I think it's Key West. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I never have. No.
Yeah, it's a Key West is a interesting place, but good time. I mean, I guess Florida in general is a interesting place, but especially it's actually really beautiful the whole drive down Key West. But either way, so my last question for you is, what advice would you have for someone coming into wanting to write, wanting to write, especially when it's the scuba industry, the underwater world? What advice would you have to that person that's just starting out, or I hate to say they have that the writer's block, or they just don't know where to go? I should say they're just kind of at a crossroads of what direction should I go. What advice would you have for the young and up and coming writer?
Everyone will tell you, and I will too, that just write. Just sit down and start writing. That's the advice people give you. Whether it's write 2 hours a day or whatever. The other one I would throw in there is, I believe you write what you read. If you read rubbish, you'll write rubbish. If you read good authors, you'll write well. Again, it's a bit the analogy of music. You can't lock yourself in a room and listen to heavy metal music for 6 months and then come out and sit down and write classical music. You will write what you read. If you're having trouble sitting down and putting the words on the page, that's fine. Close it off. Sit down and read a book and just keep reading, because you just have to have it flowing through your brain and loosen it up. I mentor young writers as a sort of thing on the side, and I mentor and I help people struggling with their book and things like that. I'm always surprised at how many people want to be writers. They can say, look, I really want to write a book, or, whatever. It's like, great. And I say, what do you read? And they'll say, well, I don't really read much. It's like, well, how can you do that? How can you not read and then want to write? How can the artist paint but not go to galleries and look at paintings? How can the architect design a building but say, I never look at buildings? You can't do it. How can the musician say, I'm going to compose, but I just don't listen to music? Why should I? Well, you think, well, how does that work? So, yeah, no, I obviously step one, write, but step two, read. And don't read off iPads. Don't listen to audiobooks. Pick up a physical book. It's a different relationship with the words when you're actually holding a book to when you're actually having someone read it to you. The pacing is different. If you're reading off a page, your eyes are relating to your brain and picking up the words at your speed. If someone's reading it to you, if you're reading a book and you're sort of not sure about a word, you pause, you think. If you're listening to an audio book, you don't get that opportunity. It's just gone. The other thing about a book, it's a different relationship to the reader than a Kindle or an iPad or whatever, is that when you're reading a book, it's you and the book. Pick up a Kindle, iPad, whatever. The first thing you do is you look in the corner and see you've got 27% battery life. You got all these other things going at you. You're halfway through whatever you're reading, and up comes a little flash thing saying there's a sale now on 20% off. Or it's a different relationship. As simple and as basic as it sounds, if you're going to write, read books. There's no shortcuts. There's no way around it. Lots of people want to sort of say, oh, look, I'm an author. I've had my book published. I'm going off to the Writers' Festival to speak, and all wonderful stuff. But underneath all that, you got to do it. You got to sit down at your desk and just plain write. I don't know if that helps you, Nick, or makes it worse.
That's a really great perspective. And to be honest, I never looked at it that way, because your influences are coming in from everywhere, right? So the more, if you're reading on things that you like, and I mean, literally, you're making me want to go grab a book and start reading. I actually just started reading a book on the way back. I was just in Indonesia, and someone let me borrow a book, and kind of I'm starting to get into the whole rebreather world, and someone loaned me a book about rebreathers, and I was like, oh, I'm on the plane, I'll just start reading it. And no, that is a really, really great perspective. So thank you. That's going to give me a lot to think about. So what is the book that you're currently reading, or is there like 25 different books that you're in between?
I actually read lots of different books at the same time, and this will sound a bit odd, but it's a bit like people have a playlist of their music. They're not going to listen to a whole album. They'll pick off a song and like that song, and then a song from another artist, another album. They form a playlist. This will sound a bit odd, but what I do is I have I'll pick passages. If I'm reading a book and I find a really great passage, or 3 or 4 pages, and think that's just so well written, I'll actually copy it or print it out, just copy the pages, whatever. And I've got this 2-ring binder, and I'll print out half a dozen pages from a particular book and stick it in the binder. And then next to that will be something else, of a different book, a few other pages. And so it becomes my sort of portable book playlist of passages I particularly like. E.M. Forster's Passage to India. He spends the first 3 or 4 pages describing Chandrapur in India. And in those few pages, you just get this whole sense of the place and the people and the smells and the disparity of the wealth and everything. But the way he describes it is absolutely brilliant, So that goes in the playlist kind of thing. Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd, he describes what they call the shearing barn, which is a massive old building where they shear the sheep. But he's describing it in such a way, and the light coming in the windows and the men coming up to shear, hundreds of sheep in this little English countryside. But he's talking about the barn, and he's talking about the other structures around it that are so old. And one of them's like the castles, and the other one's the churches. And he's talking about the functions behind, the church to go and worship, and the building's been there for hundreds of years, and the castle's been there about war and defence, and then you've got the shearing barn where you go and work and shear the sheep. And the way he describes all the shearing barn, again, in 3 or 4 pages, it's like, oh, that is just brilliant. That's on another level, So again, gets photostated, comes out, goes in the playlist, and it's kind of like I build that up kind of thing. So no particular book that I say fantastic. The Moon and Sixpence always been a favourite. The way he does the biography of this artist without actually really knowing him very well. So books like that, sure. I guess you're just kind of aspiring to them, I mean, if you're going to write music, listen to the very best and say, that's what I'm trying to reach. As I said before, you'll write what you read. If you read rubbish, you'll write rubbish. Look for the good stuff, and that way you kind of improve your skills.
Okay, no, I love that, man, and you've given me a lot to think about and kind of pursue, because that's definitely, I don't know. I mean, obviously I don't think of everything, but I've never looked at it like that. And that's a very, very interesting perspective that I like that a lot. Well, Jeff, I really, really want to thank you for coming on to the podcast. This has been absolutely amazing to hear about your journey into scuba diving, why you're writing about the history of scuba diving, and then just gaining your perspectives on a lot of different aspects of the writing world.
Thanks, Nick. And I think we got a little bit off topic with diving there for a while, but
all good. That's what's great about conversation. You can move it around.
Anyway, great to talk to you, Nick.
Off-gassing, a scuba podcast.